hand over to our speaker, Dr. Andrew Buell.
Hello. I'm Andrew Buell. I actually don't work at the university. I work for what's called the National Oceanography Centre. We've just become we've been there in this docks for about 23 or 24 years. And I work in a group there called the Marine Systems Modelling. And it'll become clearer what I mean by this. And I'm going to talk tonight about what I do in my job and how that fits, and that's essentially modelling living systems in the ocean and how that becomes part of the kind of climate models you'll be kind of familiar with from the news and what have you. So first of all, I just want to say a little bit about, for those who don't know, that's the Oceanography Centre there. We're down behind Dockgate 4, so right down in the front of Southampton. You can sort of see that's us there. It's a purpose-built facility that was built to house both the university and the government lab that used to be located up in Wormley, is that Sussex, I think, or something. Our institute, the Oceanography Centre, we're about 190 staff, and we have students as well, and we kind of cover quite a range of oceanographic topics. So we have biology, people who study biology, people who do physics, we have a large geology group, we have modelling, which is the group I'm part of, and then we also have a large technology division, and that's a particular kind of a real growing part of our centre, and that's to develop autonomous vehicles, and also it's related to our ships as well. So you can sort of see we're right in the waterfront here, and we actually launch our research ships from just outside the front door. The dock is perhaps more famous for being not our research ships, but where the Titanic sailed from, and that's obviously perhaps a bit of history there. Obviously, didn't end so well then. So about the group I'm a member of, it's one of 5 sort of science groups within the NOC. We're kind of split. We're actually split. We have a sister institute up in Liverpool. So we have and that's also called NOC as well. In the south, in Southampton, we focus on the deep ocean. So we're interested in the open ocean away from what we call the shelves. So that's waters that are like less than 200 metres of deep. We call those are sort of continental shelves. And we tend not to focus on those. We tend to focus on deeper waters in Southampton. The main thing we do in the group is build what we like physically realistic models of the ocean. Again, I'll come back on some of these things later. Don't worry too much about that. And that's primarily to understand how the ocean itself works, and also how it interacts with the climate. And one of the subgroups of this group is the group I'm a member of. And what we're interested in is adding to these models living systems. So separate from the ocean physics, we're interested in how living systems work in the ocean. That's going to be the subject of my talk today. And one of the things that our models are used for, separate to what we do, separate to our own interests, is we use some of the outputs from our models to sort of drive sort of socio-economic stuff. So if people are interested in fisheries, sometimes they'll take stuff from our models and use those to drive them. And we'll get back to some of the models later, don't worry so much about that. Just a bit about me before I go any further. So I'm actually a biologist. Although I work in a modelling department, mathematical modelling department, I am originally a biologist. I trained at the University of Dundee. I then studied Plankton, the University of Warwick, which is probably about as far as you can get from the sea, and still be inside the UK. And at that time, I was more interested in sort of simple computer models of open ocean and plankton ecosystems. And I moved to Southampton, what now seems an incredibly long time ago. Initially to work at university, and then I moved about 10 years ago to work for the NOC properly. So I started to work for the government, effectively. And almost all of the work I do is computer modelling and of marine life at the global scale. I'm not really interested in what happens in particular parts of the ocean. I'm only interested in the whole. And where I'm going to go tonight, I've kind of before I thought about my talk, I kind of thought these would be. We'll see what you think of it. So I'm going to talk about what I mean by marine biogeochemistry. I'll come on to what that kind of clunky word means. Essentially, how life runs the ocean and how life runs and is run on ocean chemistry. So ocean chemistry is quite important, and biology is an important part of that as well. I'm now going to say something about ecological modelling, what I mean by ecological modelling, and just a kind of a really rough overview of what that is. And then I'm finally just going to finish up on something about the sort of bigger picture and how the work we do fits into kind of global climate research. Okay, so this is a few caveats to start with. So first of all, this is the first time I've ever talked in public. And I'm not sure if we'll see how we go, but I may not judge this just right. So if I explain something badly as we're going through, just by all means ask me to explain again. I'm happy to take questions at the end of the talk, but I'm happy to also take questions during the talk if you want. There's something you're not quite sure about, just ask. And if I talk too fast, which is normal for me as I say there, am I talking too fast already?
Yes.
Okay. Audience participation. Or I'll try to go a bit slower. I can't promise, but just keep reminding me. That's just the way I always talk too fast. I'll try and keep it slow, but I'm not very good at that. Okay, so I'll just start by saying something about me in biology and chemistry. As you can tell from the word, it's a sort of a portmanteau of biology, geology, and chemistry, and it's all of those. It's a kind of a mixed subject, and we take input from biologists, we take input from chemists, marine chemists, and also there's a component that comes from geology as well. And we also are embedded inside the ocean, and so therefore ocean physics is important too. So first of all, what's marine biology all about? So you probably have some ideas about that kind of already, and those ideas are these sorts of things. This is sort of a representative subsample of the kind of sea denizens you're probably all familiar with. You have sharks, starfish, dolphins, urchins, killer whales, and so on. Cuttlefish, suckerfish, octopus, we've got a lobster there, jellyfish. I thought that's what that's called actually, I can't remember. And we've got some mollusk, some kind of mollusk down there as well. So that's I suppose what we typically think of as being sort of marine biology. That's actually only really a small set of the living systems in the ocean. They're all animals. They're all what we call, I suppose, taxonomically we call animals. And they're part of they're only a very, very small set of all the kind of living things that we know about. So they're just up there in this corner here. Then we have a whole we essentially divide the living systems of the Earth into three main groups. We have the eukaryotes over here. That's things like us, usually large, typically multicellular animals, and plants and fungi, things like that. We have the bacteria over here. Eubacteria. Those are the bacteria you're perhaps more familiar with. And then over the last about 30 or 40 years, we've realised there's another kind of bacteria which are actually more closely related to us than to the rest of the bacteria, called the archaea. So the point I'm making here is really, when we think about life in the oceans, we tend to think about the creatures that are there, but in actual fact, there's a kind of a much larger, it's not really come out quite right, there's a much larger set of organisms in the sea which are kind of important there. I've tried to highlight them, but you can't actually see them there. So things like we have this fungi in the ocean, there's algae, there's protozoans, that's small animals, single-cell animals. We've got some archaebacteria, the cyanobacteria, which some of you might be familiar with, because every so often the pond in the common gets closed off because there's cyanobacteria growing in it, and they're poisonous. So they don't just live in the sea as well. Okay, so one of the things which is most striking about life in the ocean, and it's quite different from life on land, is size. So when we think of living things on land, we typically think of things like ourselves. And in fact, on the land, most of the organisms there are, certainly some of the dominant organisms, are large things. So there are things like trees, flowers, grasses. They form the base of the food web, and they are large, just like us. But by contrast, in the ocean, with some exceptions that you do get, obviously you get large animals like whales. Some of the biggest animals in the world are in the ocean. But on the majority of things living in the ocean are quite different. They're much, much smaller. Typically microscopic. And this raises the kind of obvious question, so why, by contrast, is everything so small in the ocean? So there's a couple of different things that favour why you should be small in the ocean, why you shouldn't be big. One of the things is, like the covenant of plants in the ocean, the phytoplankton, we'll come back to them in a bit, they need to have light to grow, and light's only available in the upper part of the ocean. Most of the ocean is completely dark. Light gets attenuated down the water column very quickly, and usually only in the upper 100 or 200 metres there's any light at all. Below that, it's just pitch blackness. So for any kind of plant life, you have to be in the upper ocean. And one of the problems, of course, is with maintaining your buoyancy and not sinking out. But smaller organisms sink slower. So it's easier to stay in the upper part of the ocean if you're small. Larger organisms will sink out and they'll quickly remove themselves from the upper ocean and where the light was if they need. Another thing which favours smaller organisms, particularly again phytoplankton, is all when you're in a water, you kind of, I suppose, it's difficult to appreciate if you live in the air, but around you have a kind of a small boundary there. It's a kind of, I suppose, as you move through the air, obviously the speed of the air drops to zero at your surface, the surface of your skin. That's a kind of, you have a kind of a boundary there. In the ocean, this is much more important. The nature of water is such that with viscosity, it's more important, and that means the boundary there can be quite important if you live in the ocean. And one of the reasons it's important again is if you're trying to suck nutrients out of the water, this boundary there effectively blocks that. And the bigger you are, the bigger the boundary there. And again, this mitigates against being big, which favours you being small. That's the attraction. And another thing about being big in the ocean is the sort of mechanical stresses of being stretched and strained by ocean currents. Because water is more viscous, that means that those stresses and strains are much more vigorous, and it's harder to be big without being damaged by those strains. Whereas if you're small, you just get swept along with the current. You're not experiencing the mechanical stress and strain as if you were big. So that's another thing which favours smaller organisms rather than larger ones. So although the majority of organisms that drive at the bottom of the food web and immediately above that, the bottom of the food web, are small, there's still a lot of diversity down there. There's a lot of free-living cells. That's individual cells. They just go through their lives as a single cell. They divide, and the two daughter cells go off. Sometimes they're asexual, so they just basically keep dividing. Sometimes they're not. So sometimes they'll try to buddy up with someone else and have a normal sex. Sometimes not. Sometimes you get them they'll exist in colonial forms. So sometimes they'll grow in small chains. And that has consequences. Particularly, one of the interesting things is if you make yourself a little bit bigger, that makes it a little bit harder for things to eat you because they can't fit you in the mouth. So that's one reason for being in chains of spheres. Sometimes the organisms live in association with other organisms. The kind of best example is like corals, where corals actually, the way they make their living is by taking phytoplankton from the water and taking it inside themselves and basically enslaving it. To get them to make food for them. And finally, you even have organisms which they may look like plants or they may look like animals, but they're actually doing a bit of both, and they just pick and choose what they do depending on the circumstances they sort of find themselves in. And here's just a couple of examples of phytoplankton. These are some of the more famous examples that we sort of say. So up here we have the kind of cyanobacteria. These are the bacteria I mentioned before. Very, very simple cell structure. And they're dominant in kind of tropical regions of the ocean. You can sort of see here they're in chains, and these are the ones that also, as I say, pollute the commons, the ponds and the common. A very important group is one called the diatoms, and they're eukaryotes like us, although obviously they're not like us at all in every other sense. And they're very more complex cell structure. They actually build their walls from silicon, so they use silicon in seawater and use it to build a shell around themselves. It's actually one of the ingredients in toothpaste is actually it's diatoms. That's where it kind of comes from, and they have a very particular role in the kind of the flowering of the oceans in the early spring. Another group which I guess some people might be familiar with are these cochleophoridae. You'll be very familiar with them if you've been to Dover and have been to see the White Cliffs there. These are formed from the remnants of these cochleophoridae. Again, they're eukaryotes. And they this time, instead of building their cell walls from silicon, they build their cell walls from calcium carbonate. And that's, as I say, that's what then winds up in the White Cliffs of Dover. And these are easier to see because when they bloom, when they get very large concentrations, as you can sort of see here, they make the water quite milky. And you can actually see them very clearly from space. And even if you're at ground level, you can see them in the water around you because it turns the water quite opaque and quite blue, milky colour. And finally, another group here is this what we call dinoflagellates. They're kind of interesting because again, they're eukaryotes like some other ones. They make the walls in a slightly different way, but they're very well known for being either plants or animals or just doing what they want in between. And so sometimes there'll be plants and sometimes there'll be animals. And they'll just pick and choose, as I said earlier, depending on what the conditions are. So at some points when the conditions are good for growing, like normally, like using nutrients and light, they'll just do that. And then as soon as the nutrients run out, they'll start eating other things in the water around them. They're partly doing that. So as a kind of example of the sort of the very, very bottom of the food chain, the phytoplankton upon which everything else rests. Again, these are all small animals. This is the kind of sort of the next level up. So this is kind of animals at the kind of near the bottom of the food chain. And so some of these you may be familiar with, some not. You obviously be familiar with this chap here. This is the krill. So these are quite dominant organisms in the Southern Ocean around Antarctica. But some of these others maybe not so much. These ones here, copepods, they're crustaceans, the same as krill, but they're much less familiar. There are no real big copepods. They're not things you would have in a seafood salad or something like that. They're not that kind of. So they're much less familiar to us. But they're very, very extremely important in the ocean, particularly important in the North Atlantic. This is a kind of it's related to snails. It's a mollusk. It's called a pteropod. But it's a swimming pteropod. So it swims around. And you can sort of see these big wings. Effectively, it sort of flies through the sea, consuming other plankton. This is actually it's actually very difficult to see. But this is the thing here. It's a foreign referent. It's a kind of it's almost like, I think it's a single cell organism, usually surrounded by these long spines. And it gets an animal, and what you can actually see here is it's actually eating the remains of a copepod. And this is another similar type of organism called a radiolarian. It's a little bit like the diatoms, and it also uses silicon. That's what it likes to build itself out. But similar kind of idea again. And again, an animal eating phytoplankton usually. This is just to give you some of the idea that you may not be familiar with these organisms at all, but these are kind of really important in the ocean. So this is the kind of the food chain. So we start at the top here with the organisms we're perhaps more familiar with, the kind of larger organisms. They ride the top. These organisms, these are the zooplankton here, and then at the very bottom you have your phytoplankton here. So when we study this, one of the things we want to know, one of the things most important is to what's going on down here. What's driving this? Obviously we know these are eating these, but how are these growing? What's controlling the growth of them? And so I'm just going to give a quick sort of primer on what controls the phytoplankton, because that's the most important level in the food chain. If you don't have them, you have nothing else above it. Everything else will start running out. You have to have these at the bottom. And what they do isn't a huge surprise. They work in the same way as plants on land. So they have a limited number of requirements. They basically want light, nutrients, and they want carbon dioxide. We'll come back to carbon later. That's quite important. But that's kind of all they want, which sounds simple. So how does it work? So I've already said that. You need two things. The first thing is light, and as I mentioned before, one of the things that's important about light in the ocean is there's a lot of it at the surface, not so much lower down. And as I say, it very quickly attenuates. And at below about 100 meters, you're really running out of light. There's almost nothing there. That's one thing. Another thing, which I've also kind of touched on before, are nutrients. So these are things like nitrate, phosphate, silicate. These very, very simple chemicals, which when you build them up, use energy to do so. You can make more complicated molecules, and then you can make proteins from them. Any kind of organic material will be built off the back of these nutrients. And the important thing is, they occur in particular vertical arrangement in the ocean. So light's high at the top, nutrients are generally high at the bottom. But one of the things which is kind of quite important in the ocean is mixing. So the ocean is mixed at the surface, usually by turbulent interaction with the atmosphere. So the atmosphere moves across the surface of the ocean, and there's a bit of momentum transfer between the ocean and the atmosphere. And what that turns into is turbulent kinetic energy. So the surface ocean is kind of mixed up. And what that tends to do is it tends to mix the nutrients from deeper in the water column up to the surface. And then you start having high nutrients and high light and high nutrients in the same place. The story's not quite as simple as that. When mixing is too strong, what tends to happen is, if you can imagine yourself as a single phytoplankton cell, you're getting mixed. But you're being mixed all the way down the water column. Half the time it's dark, half the time it's light. It's not very good growing conditions. And so the precise amount of mixing is quite important. And if you start having less mixing, so for example the wind drops, the weather improves like it does as you go from winter into spring and into summer, you can then you trap the phytoplankton at the surface of the ocean. They're not being mixed so deep. There's lots of nutrients, lots of light, and then you have these blooms. And I suppose most of you have heard of phytoplankton blooms. They happen every year in the ocean. It's at most parts of the ocean. Around springtime, when the weather changes and you have this kind of suddenly the conditions on the surface of the ocean are great. And so you have phytoplankton blooms, and then that translates subsequently into a zooplankton bloom, and so on. And that's really how it drives. It's not the same in every part of the ocean. In the tropical oceans, the conditions, although they have very good light all year round, the nature of the ocean there is it's much more, it's very heated very strongly, and what that means is you wind up with a layer of warm water on top of a layer of cold water. It's very difficult to mix that. And what that turns into is the nutrients get stuck deep in the ocean, so you have nothing happening on the surface and across much of the tropical oceans. I'll come back to that a bit later. So although the actual exact range of mixing is kind of quite important, that's something which there's no real analogue for that on land. We don't really have quite the same features as that on land. That's something which is quite unique to the ocean, the role that mixing plays. In terms of light limitation, obviously we know why that is. Why does it vary seasonally? It varies seasonally just quite simply because the angle of inclination of the sun to the Earth, the sun even. So in the summer, when the northern hemisphere, this in the case of the northern hemisphere, the Earth is tilted towards the sun. You have a lot of light being stretched across the surface of the Earth. As you move into winter, when the inclination of the Earth is away, or the northern hemisphere, I should say, is away from the sun. Obviously, you have much less light. So the average amount of light reaching the surface of the ocean and the surface of the Earth as well is much less. So that's what's kind of driving the seasonal part of that. In terms of nutrients, the concentrations of these vary a lot across the ocean. This is a picture of salt. So this is nitrate. This is one of the nutrients, which is kind of pivotal for plants in the ocean. They use it to make proteins. The concentrations, the high concentrations are in the red. The low concentrations are in the purple here. And you can sort of see straight away there's a very strong geographical pattern. So the high latitudes, both in the north and in the south, you have quite high concentrations. Whereas in the low latitudes, with the exception of some places around here, which they have much lower concentrations. And what that means is, it means that this really controls the productivity in the ocean. The light obviously is important too, but this is the kind of a background against which the light operates. And what it really means is large parts of the ocean are effectively deserts. No matter how much light they have, it doesn't matter. They've just got no nutrients, and so nothing grows. But as I say, there are exceptions in the tropics, and those exceptions are in the areas where you have upwelling regions, where nutrients are brought to the surface by ocean currents, and then they come from deep and brought to the surface, and then you have them. But otherwise, nutrients are quite low. So away from those regions, you have a very low concentration. And we tend to think as oceanographers, we tend to think of the tropics as being like deserts. They're almost the equivalent of deserts on land. They're obviously not dry, but like the deserts on land which are missing water, they're missing something as well, and they're missing nutrients.
So where does all the nitrates come from in the Southern Ocean?
We'll get back to that. So this is just a kind of a very, very simple description of what's driving, why we get these kind of patterns of nutrients. And so in the ocean you have this kind of large-scale circulation. It's called the thermohaline circulation. We're not going to talk about that today. It's too complicated. But essentially you have water. Essentially you have a kind of an overturning of the ocean. So water that is water moves from the surface of the ocean to the deep ocean. It's driven by a number of things, but it's a thermohaline circulation largely because it's driven by density in the ocean. And density is really quite important, and it's driven by the temperature and the salinity of the water, and that changes the density of the water, and you have differences in density of the water in different parts of the water. In high latitude regions like the North Atlantic, you have water which is very cold because it's in the North Atlantic, and you also have it can be very salty as well. A lot of water as the water comes up the Gulf Stream, evaporates a lot, and that tends to increase the concentration of salt in the North Atlantic. And so in the very high North Atlantic, you wind up with water which it's both cold and it's salty. And what that tends to do is it's more dense, and it tends to subduct into the ocean interior. And through a long chain, which actually this process can take hundreds to even thousands of years in the case of the North Pacific. And the water is kind of circulated around. As I say, it's much more complicated than this, and this is not the talk for that. Ask someone else, ask some of my colleagues about it, they'll tell you all about this. It's absolutely fascinating. And what this system means in other parts of the ocean, you have the reverse, and you have upwelling water as well. And that water comes up cold, and so some regions like for the equatorial region, particularly the Pacific, you have quite cold water being brought. But in fact, anywhere where you have upwelling around the world, you tend to have quite cold water, and that can be in contrast to the climate adjacent to that. So you can have the warmest climate on land, but just next door as you have these, you can have very, very cold water, and that's because of this upwelling. And one of the things that upwelling brings is it brings nutrients up to the surface as well. And of course, that then fuels the phytoplankton in the surface. But nothing lasts forever. They run out of nutrients and then they die. And the reverse process then happens. They start sinking back down into the ocean. And this is part of the cycle which basically moves nutrients from the surface to the deep and then back again. Mixing plays a role here as well, but at the large scale, this kind of the sort of circulation of the ocean is important. We'll come back to what I've called the biological pump here later. So that's that. So that's nutrients which are in the ocean already, but not all nutrients that are important in the ocean actually originate in the ocean. So this is actually a map based on dust deposition around the world. Again, the red colours are high dust deposition, and the purple colours are low dust deposition. One of the things dust is doing is picking up. It's dust. It's picked up from typically dry, arid regions of the Earth. It gets carried in the air, and then it gets deposited. It gets deposited in the land as well as the ocean. But in the ocean, it's kind of very important because it plays a role in transferring iron to the ocean. So some of the highest concentrations of dust falling in the ocean are around the Sahara, so a lot in the North Atlantic, because dust's being swept off the Sahara into the Atlantic. And also just generally, wherever you have deserts around Australia, there's deserts around South America as well. But there are some regions where you have, most noticeably, to touch back on the point you asked before about why nitrate was so high in the Southern Ocean, around Antarctica. First of all, Antarctica is really the driest continent on Earth. It doesn't really have much dust, it's covered in ice. And another thing you can sort of see about the Antarctica, at the latitude of Antarctica and the Southern Ocean around it's at, there's a kind of you can move continuously around the whole Earth in a circle without ever bumping into land. And that, of course, the predominant air currents in the atmosphere are sort of around the Earth as well. And so what happens is these air currents carry no dust. So in regions like the Southern Ocean, you have no dust dropping into them, and as a consequence you have very low iron. And if you have and one of the things, of course, about nutrients, you can't just make a life on iron, you can't just grow on iron, you have to have a mixture of nutrients, you have to have nitrogen and phosphorus and iron. But as a result, it means that you have no iron, and that means you can't use the iron, you can't use the nitrate either. So what happens is you tend to build up high concentrations of nitrate in those regions. Again, the story is a little bit more complicated than that, but that's the general gist. And there's an idea that one of the things that drives or helps drive the ice age cycles and the Earth's climate is the availability of iron from Antarctica. When the climate gets drier and more arid during an ice age, you get more dust. You have a kind of which draws down more CO2 from the atmosphere, which then makes it colder. And so iron is viewed as possibly a trigger and related to iron cycling. It's also why there are some people who think one of the ways to solution to the climate crisis is to drop iron in the ocean and try to fertilise it. We're not going to touch on that today. But I'll ask some questions about it later if you want. So right, in summary for biogeochemistry. So unlike on land, the ocean is ultimately driven by microscopic primary producers. So the phytoplankton in the ocean versus the trees on land. Trees on land are enormous, phytoplankton are very small. There are lots of different types, lots of different lifestyles of phytoplankton in the larger grazers as well. By which I mean there's lots of different ways to eat small phytoplankton. You can hunt them down individually. You can do what like larger animals just do and swim with your mouth open and just swallow them that way. There's lots of different ways to live their life. Productivity in the ocean is driven by where you get both high light and high nutrients. And the abundance of both is really driven by physical processes, and these operate from the local scale, so you can have a little bit of local wind in a small region that have more mixing, bring up more nutrients, or you can have these large-scale processes like the thermohaline circulation, and in fact the deposition of dust, which happens at really, really enormous scales. So the processes which are important in the ocean can operate across all different scales. And as I say, some nutrients reach from the surface ocean, some reach the surface ocean from below, and some instead from above. And of course, there's other methods for nutrients to reach the ocean as well. Some they'll come down rivers. That's obviously another way. And there are also sources inside the ocean as well. You have hydrothermal vents that provide nutrients too. And in the case of nitrogen, in fact, some phytoplankton can actually synthesize nitrate from scratch. They'll take it out. There's lots of nitrogen in the atmosphere. There's lots of dinitrogen in the atmosphere, and there's lots of dinitrogen in the ocean as well, but it's no use to anyone. You can't reuse it for anything. But if you can turn it into nitrate, then you can use it. And there are some phytoplankton that do that as well. But they require other things to make their life easier. So that's what I want to say to start off about biogeochemistry. And I'll say something now about ecosystem modelling, what I mean by that. So first of all, what do I mean by a model? You're probably, I'm not sure, maybe I've been doing this for 25 years. It's very obvious to me, but maybe a bit obvious to anyone else. So what we essentially do as scientists is we kind of collect facts about different bits of the world, and we do that. We make observations, we make measurements, we do experiments, and we kind of generally build up a kind of an idea, a kind of an understanding of kind of what's going on. And when we talk about modelling, what we're essentially doing is trying to stitch all that together. So take these individual bits and pieces of the world and stitch them together into kind of a sort of a fabric of how we think things are working. And we typically do that in the language of mathematics. We don't always. Sometimes when we mean a model, we mean like just a conceptual model about how it's actually working. But typically, and what I'm going to talk about, is we use the language of maths. So we write equations, we describe things just as numbers. And sometimes these models can be solved with pen and paper, and I've done this myself. You can, if you have a simple enough model with a small enough number of equations, you can just work through them yourself and come up with an answer. But the real world is quite complex, and as a result, the models that we build of it have to reflect some of that complexity. And very quickly, the more complex a model becomes, the harder it is to solve in pen and paper. It becomes intractable. In fact, it may not even be possible to solve it in pen and paper. And you then you switch to using a computer and say, give the computer the equations and say, now you solve it. And the computer goes away, chugs through it, and of course it can work much faster and solve them that way. That's what I mean in broad terms of model. I'll give some more examples later, but there are many, just to give some idea about why we want to use them, why would you want to use a model in the first place. So one thing is because it's maybe expensive to actually carry out experiments in the real world. So there's lots of stuff done. For example, the bottom picture there's aerodynamics around a car. You might want to, rather than actually keep building different cars and keep measuring them, putting them in wind tunnels and working out what happens, you might say, well, let's not keep building these cars. Let's just simulate it in the computer, do it that way, and save ourselves some money, and we can prototype things much faster. That's one reason. Another one is because there's some sort of experiments you don't want to do in the real world. Some people don't like being flooded. Some people don't like being exposed to nuclear weapons testing. So you use models to do this. And there are people out there whose jobs are basically doing precisely this. Trying to understand trying to use computers to try to understand the forces and the quantities of material that are generated in these sorts of events and what happens to them. And another way, because it's just not possible to do some things. So, we can't really do an experiment with a hurricane in the laboratory. That's not really kind of possible at all. We have to actually somehow represent, we either have to just confine ourselves to observations and not understand it fully, or we can try to run it in a computer simulation and try to do it that way, try to understand. And of course, perhaps the example which is closest to what I'm going to talk about today is the example of sort of climate change and trying to look into the future. So long as we don't have time machines, the computers are one of the best ways to try to peek into the future and try to see from our understanding now what happened, what could happen. And we'll come back to that later on. So, in terms of what, and I'll show an example in a second. So in terms of what I mean by ecosystem models, what we typically do is we identify in the world what are the most important ecological actors. Those are the players in the world which we know are doing the most work. They're most abundant, they're doing most of the photosynthesis, they're the things that are important. And we know from, well, I've already given you the answer already, the important things there are at the bottom of the food chain. So the phytoplankton and the zooplankton. And we also know, and again I've given you the answer already, what's kind of controlling them? What are the things that are important? What makes their life easier? Why do they grow in some places and not grow in other places? And that again is down to the light and nutrients. And we know that we know all these things. We didn't imagine these things from first principles. Long before people did computer modelling, people had already studied these systems extensively, so they kind of knew these things were kind of important. And then finally, what we do is we then take these actors, and we take these controlling factors, and we stitch them together to make as equations into a food web. And I'll just show you. This is a picture. Don't get alarmed. This is an ecosystem model. This is an ecosystem model I use. And I'll just quickly go through it. The details are not particularly important. At the bottom we have our nutrients. So there's our nitrates and our ammonia. There's our iron. There's our silicon. There's carbon here as well. There's something called alkalinity, which I'm absolutely no way I'm telling you about. Then we have our phytoplankton up here. We have different types of phytoplankton. We have our diatoms, which I mentioned earlier. Here we've simplified the world down. We've just said there's diatoms and there's everyone else. And that's just the way we've done it. We've simplified the world in that way. And that's a feature of modelling. There's always a point where you say, the real world's too complicated. Let's just make an assumption. We just say everything is like this. And again, here we have these are zooplankton. In this particular model, we say there is small zooplankton and big zooplankton, and that controls the nature of the food web. So these non-diatoms are we think of them as being small, so they're eaten by small zooplankton, but they're also eaten by large ones. But the large zooplankton they'll eat all these guys below them, and they'll eat these other little animals as well. And then, as all things must, the way of flesh, everything turns into dead material. And after a certain period of time, there's a bacterial breakdown, dead material is turned back to nutrients. And so that's the kind of food web. We're missing, as the sharp rider, you'll notice, where's the fish? We don't have anything, we tend to cut off. To simplify our equations, we cut off the fish. They actually are, relatively speaking, although they're very important to us humans, they're relatively not important in the ocean. They play a small role as far as phytoplankton is concerned, it's like as if they're not there. They play a very small role in that. So we've decided to simplify our model and stop it there. So that's an example. That's an example of a simple food web model that we would use in our work. And I'll warn you that the next page there are equations, but don't panic. This is what they model. They haven't rendered very well, but this is kind of what the equations that underlie these models look like. So there are I don't look too carefully at detail. I'll go through it very carefully. We basically just have a series of different terms. So this is the phytoplankton here. They grow. They're eaten by. Oops. I think the rendering is a bit of a problem. They're eaten by small zooplankton. They're eaten by large zooplankton. They die, and they die because they get viruses. So the equations are very, very simple in a way. So for each of these little boxes we had in the model, we have an equation behind that, and that equation is just a series of little terms, each one of which describes some aspect of their life. And I'll just show you. There's some examples at the bottom here. So when I say that an equation, so for example, in the case of light and nutrients, we just have a very, very simple function. We just sort of say, as light goes up, the growth rate of phytoplankton goes up as well. It's a saturating thing, so what happens is, above a certain point, they don't grow any faster. They saturate and they can't grow any faster. And it's the same is true for nutrients as well. As you add more nutrients, things grow faster at first, and then eventually they saturate. There comes a point where no matter how much nutrient there is, they can't use it fast enough, so they saturate. But the important thing to know about all these equations is they're highly simplified relationships of what's really going on in the ocean. They're often based on lab work, so people will do experiments. They'll take samples of water from the sea, and they'll do experiments where they vary the amount of light or they vary the amount of nutrients. And so these very, very simple equations we have are based on what we've got from experiments like that. Sometimes they come from more theoretical things. The bottom of the food chain is relatively simple because phytoplankton are only interested in a few things. They're interested in light, they're interested in nutrients. But when you start going up the food chain, you start finding the things that live there are interested in lots of different things. So the relationships get a bit more complicated, and the models become a bit more sketchy, a bit more cagey. But we can ask questions about that later. But anyway, this is just a health warning. Underneath all these models is rather really quite simple and simplified versions of reality. So, as I've kind of already touched on, while physics is important for things that live on the land as well, in the ocean physics is absolutely critical. And so when we model phytoplankton, we model living systems in the ocean, it's critical we do a good job of the physics. And how do we model physics? Well, this isn't the talk for that, but I can just say a little bit about it. So in terms of the ocean, the key actors there are things like temperature and salinity. And we know how those are affected by things like solar heating, evaporation, rainfall, those things are affected by that and by winds as well, so what the atmosphere is doing. So in the same way that we simplify the living systems of the ocean down to a few boxes, what have you, in the ocean physics something similar is done, although the difference being ocean physics is actually a much simpler thing in a way. The equations to describe how water behaves, how it warms up when you apply a certain amount of heat, how salinity changes when you apply a certain amount of fresh water. These things are much better understood. And as a result, physical models are usually much better, more accurate than biological models. And as I say, there's a whole talk on these alone. And if you'd like, we can arrange for someone else to come and talk about that. In crudely, what do we do when we try to model the whole ocean? What we do is we chop the world into little boxes, as you can sort of see here. And each of these little boxes is a little world. They're all connected to each other, and they're connected by things like ocean currents, ocean mixing, all these sort of processes. And as I say, we simplify the physics, so we do actually, although we represent a lot of the processes that are important in the physics, we are still simplifying it quite a lot. And we are actually representing the world by these little regions can still be, tens or even 100 kilometers in size. They can be enormous, and inside that, everything's the same. So that you can sort of see we're making a very crude representation of the world. And then what we just do is, in every little box, we calculate how much heat's being applied to the ocean, how much fresh water is being applied to the ocean, how much evaporation there is, and then how the water changes in density, and how that affects the ocean circulation. And then what we do is the boxes speak to each other, and then we move forward in time, and then we just repeat the whole process again. And this is how and in doing this, we sort of simulate how the ocean moves. And I'm just going to show you if it works. An example of this. Are you going to work? Right. Oh, damn it. There we go. Right. So this is the model we use. And this is the model we use, starting from it. The models are completely at rest, and then we just say go, and the model starts moving. What you're seeing here is you're seeing in the blue and the white. The white is fast-moving ocean currents. The blue is slow-moving ocean currents. And so you can sort of see straight away there's some features you may be familiar with. There's the Gulf Stream running up the side of North America. Here's the equatorial upwelling I was mentioning before, along the equatorial Pacific. There's the Kuroshiru up the side of Japan. That's the kind of analog to the Gulf Stream, but in the Pacific. And you can sort of see there's all kinds of little wriggly features. There's all kinds of very, very small scale stuff. You can also see patches of white appearing and disappearing, and that's weather systems passing across the surface of the ocean as well. And you can see in some parts of the ocean, things get very, very complicated. There you go, it's still good. You have these beautiful rings forming. If this counts as well. So this is complete fiction. This is a complete model simulation. There's nothing here. This isn't real. This is a representation of what the real ocean's doing. And one of the things we do is we compare how our models perform compared to the real world. So we take our model and we compare it to the observations we've made, and from that we can make our models better, and we can ascertain how good our models are. Has it stopped again? Anyway, the last thing I'm just going to show you. This is what's called the Antarctic Circumpolar Current. This is what I mentioned before. Around Antarctica, you've actually got this one place where you can go all the way around the world without ever touching the land. Whereas all the other oceans are bounded, and the east and west are land masses. I think it's stopped. I'll let it play one more time, because it's quite nice. Yeah, so we start off, nothing's happening, and then very quickly the ocean starts moving. You can sort of, there's a little clock here sort of telling, so that we started this simulation back in 1978, and then we've run it through to close to the present day. What we do in our actual models is we give the model, we tell the model at the surface what the atmosphere was like. So we say what were the conditions like in 1980. So we tell what the winds are like, where the rainfall is, how much solar heating is happening in different parts of the world. And that's all we do. And then the ocean model runs up underneath this. What you're also seeing here is this is just the surface of the ocean. This is only what's happening at the very, very top of the ocean model. Underneath this, all the way down to the seafloor, the model is doing something similar. And it's one of the things you can use a model for. So while we've got ships, our ships have been going to sea for years, there's still a problem. We've only sampled a tiny, tiny part of the ocean. We only ever will sample a tiny, tiny part. But with a model, of course, we can then start. Well, we actually retrospectively go and look what's happening in this part of the ocean at 3,000 meters. We haven't even had to go there. And as long as we can trust the model, as long as we've compared the model to what data we do know, we can maybe say we can see how much we should trust it. So that's the kind of physical models we use underneath our biological models. This is actually one of our best models. This is the resolution of this model is it's a 12th of a degree. So it's about 7 or 8 kilometers. Each little box is 7 or 8 kilometers in size. But we don't always use models at that sort of resolution. So here we have this is the model you've just seen. But often we use lower resolution. This is a 20-kilometer model. And you can sort of see at 20 kilometers you still get most of the same features, but things are slightly different. And then at this end we have my favorite model. Boxes are 100 kilometers in size. And you can sort of see, while it's getting some of the features in kind of the same place, you can also see that just by representing things by boxes at 100 kilometers in size, you just can't do as good a job. But unfortunately, this is the kind of models we use for climate change forecasting, which we'll come on to later. This is just. I'll see if I can get this one to work as well. This is actually a living thing. So this is us simulating the seasonal cycle and growth of phytoplankton. So blue means no phytoplankton, green is high, and you can sort of see as we move through the seasons, we go from this is now going to summer and then falling back into winter and then reversing, and you can sort of see the opposite patterns happening in the north and south. So what we're doing here is we're telling the model phytoplankton how much light there is, how much nutrient there is, and they're doing their thing. They're growing, they're being eaten, or they're dying, and they're just going through the full cycle. And this is quite sped up. We're already 6 or 7 years into the simulation already, and so you can sort of see the kind of, and this is what we're interested in, making models which represent what's kind of going on in the ocean. And this is actually a property called chlorophyll, which you'll know is a pigment in plants, and this is something you can see from space. So one of the things we can do is we can compare our models to what we see from space and try to decide if we're doing a good job or not. If we're not doing a good job, we change our models and try again. Okay, so it's sort of in summary about so models are really what we use them for is sort of to distill our understanding. So it's all very well having a big grab bag of facts, but you really want to pull those facts together and tell a coherent story, and we use models in science to do that. As I said already, we do that in the language of mathematics. Our understanding is never really complete, so the models are always approximations. They're always wrong in a very real sense. We always use a computer to solve them because they're just, as you can sort of see, you can imagine how many boxes were in that picture, that movie you just seen. That's not something you're going to do in the back of a bag packet. It's not going to happen. And one of the reasons we use models, because if they're good, if we can sort of see if they do a good job of representing the world as we observe it, you can then perhaps use them to try to understand things that you can't observe, or which are difficult to observe, or at scales which are different from we observe. So when we often go to sea, or my colleagues go to sea, they're in one little ship in one corner of the world, just looking at this very small area of the ocean. Whereas with a model, we can perhaps try to understand what's happening at larger scales and try to work out if there are different processes at those scales which are important. Or, in fact, we can use the models to simulate what's going on in places that we can't go to, like the future. For example, we don't have a time machine yet. Okay, so the bigger picture then. So this is the last part of the talk. I just wanted to say something about how we use these things in climate change research. So the answer is very easy. So how does what I've just shown you already, how does it fit in one word, and that word is carbon? A lot of the interest in, we'll show by demonstration. So the carbon system is obviously important because, as we know, we put carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that can affect the radiative properties of the ocean. So where radiative properties of the atmosphere lead to warming and climate change. So where is carbon in the Earth system? So this is a little diagram here, just sort of showing the atmosphere, the land, and the ocean. And although we're focused on carbon dioxide in the atmosphere because that's where it affects the climate, only a very, very small amount of carbon is actually in the atmosphere. It's less than 2% is there. There's a bit more on the land, and that's in things like trees and in soils. But by far the majority of the carbon in the Earth system, this is the kind of active reservoirs. Of course, below this you've of course got the bulk of the Earth, and there's a lot of carbon there as well, but it's not really interacting on timescales which are relevant to us. But the vast majority of carbon that's active in the Earth system is in the ocean. So understanding how that carbon is, how it gets there, and what it does when it's there is very important. So in terms of the carbon we're putting into the atmosphere, where is that going? And about half of it is still staying in the atmosphere, which is one of the reasons why atmospheric concentrations of CO2 rising, is because we're putting stuff in the atmosphere and it's staying there. But about a quarter of it is going into the ocean itself. It's being stored in the ocean. So in fact, actually, one of the things the ocean is doing is it's slowing down climate change. It's absorbing CO2 from the atmosphere, and that CO2 would otherwise be warming the climate. So in fact, actually, if it wasn't for the fact we had the ocean, and the ocean was 70% of the Earth's surface, we would have noticed climate change a long time ago. And I've certainly seen model simulations where you remove the ocean and climate change happens very quickly. Because there's nothing to absorb the CO2, it goes straight into the atmosphere, it stays in the atmosphere, and you feel the full effect. We're slightly lucky in that the ocean, and to some degree the land as well, play a role in that. So how does it get into the ocean? There's two main mechanisms. One is what's called the solubility pump, and it's just it's a simple thing just to do with the solubility of CO2 in water. So you know from fizzy drinks that CO2 can dissolve in water. You know you can have too much CO2. You can have too much CO2 in water when it bubbles out. And there's a kind of a general related to this thermohaline circulation I mentioned before, where you're moving water of different temperature and salinity around. That effectively is a way of moving CO2 around as well. So CO2 is very soluble when water is cold, and so CO2 is drawn into the cold parts of the ocean. And it's out when the water is warmed in the warmer parts of the ocean, it outgasses. And if it's tied in with the thermohaline circulation, this essentially creates a kind of a physical, chemical pump in the ocean called the solubility pump. And the majority of carbon in the ocean is driven by this. But as we've already sort of covered, it's not nutrients in the ocean do not travel alone. So when things in the ocean die, when the living things in the ocean die and sink into the ocean, they take carbon with them as well. And this is what we call the biological pump. So carbon is taken up by living things in the surface ocean, so in the same way the plants do. They draw CO2 out of the atmosphere, they combine it with nutrients, they build themselves, they live, they die, and then when they die, they sink into the ocean, they take some carbon with them. That carbon eventually turns back into dissolved carbon inside the ocean, and then in the same way with nutrients, it gets returned to the surface ocean through the operation of mixing and the thermohaline circulation. How is our CO2 getting into the ocean? Well, almost all of it through the solubility pump. The important thing is the difference in CO2 gradient between the atmosphere and the ocean is really very important. We are increasing the concentration in the atmosphere. As a result, the ocean has to respond, and it will have to take up CO2. The biological pump, not so much. The biological pump is not bothered by CO2. CO2 is abundant in the ocean. Having more of it makes no difference. The biological pump doesn't care about CO2. So, not so much. It's not quite so important. That's not the end of the story, however, for now. But the strength of the biological pump is important. So if the strength of the pump changes, if it strengthens or weakens, that will then transfer more or less carbon into the ocean interior. And from our studies of how phytoplankton respond to climate change, we expect the biological pump to get weaker, but primarily because the upwelling of nutrients will decline. What we expect to happen is the ocean is warming, as you may all be aware, and the ocean is warming from the top. And what that tends to do is it tends to make the surface of the ocean more stratified. So the surface ocean communicates less with the deep ocean. And as a result, the return flow of nutrients from the deep ocean to the surface is weakened. And when that happens, the ingassing and outgassing of CO2 by the biological pump will become quite important. It will weaken. What will tend to happen is CO2 will stay in the atmosphere more, and we'll have enhanced climate change results. So that's why, although the biological pump is not the main driver for getting CO2 into the ocean, it can be very important still for what happens in the future. But really, to understand the whole system, or rather, as I've sort of already said, the concentration gradient between the ocean atmosphere and the land is quite important. So we have to understand the Earth system properly, we have to kind of put our understanding of the ocean inside a wider context. So over the last 30 years, there's been a movement towards making our models have all aspects of the Earth in them. So this is essentially an evolution of weather models. So many years ago, people were modeling the atmosphere. And as time has passed, we've added more and more complexity to that. One of the first things we added was an ocean. We realized, early weather modelers realized that to model how the atmosphere behaves, you also have to understand the ocean. The ocean is a great reservoir of heat. And so to understand how the atmosphere retains and loses heat, you have to model the ocean. And then you start adding other things. You have to say, you have to add sea ice then, because the sea ice is very important in different parts the world, and before long, you're adding kind of everything. And the current Earth system models will include ocean components, they'll include atmospheric components, land, ice, and also the living systems in Earth as well. And the living systems are important because of this connection to the carbon cycle. These days, this is a sort of just a practical point. Usually what happens, these models are so enormously complex, what you find is Earth system models are made up of little bits of models. So people who do study the ocean, people who study the atmosphere, they work separately and they bring their models together. And this is a diagram of the model I work with. It's quite a new model. It's called UK ESM1. So the name is very obvious. United Kingdom Earth System Model 1. And what we have here is we have on this side we have the land. So we have land physics. We have land biogeochemistry. It's sort of similar to what goes on in the ocean, but different because, of course, you have trees, you have animals. It's quite a different sort of setting. And we also have a kind of a model called TRIFID, which it does the competition between trees. Someone worked very hard on that acronym. That's all I can say. And over here we have the ocean side. So we have this is the model I showed you earlier. It's called Medusa, and it does the biogeochemistry. So it's looking at the nutrients in the phytoplankton and the zooplankton. It's coupled to a physical model, which it's called NEMO. It's also someone else also worked hard on that in your acronym as well. And then we have an ice model there as well. So in certain parts of the world, the high latitudes, the north, the Arctic, and around Antarctica, you have sea ice. And sea ice is actually really very important in those regions. And then these things are all tied together, and we have an atmosphere here as well. And in the atmosphere, you have to consider chemistry in the atmosphere, because the atmosphere chemistry is quite important too. It has a role in how different chemicals are transported through the atmosphere. Aerosols are kind of important, working out what happens to the clouds. All these things are all kind of important. So this is the kind of models we work with now. And as ever, the carbon is behind all these things. That's understanding how carbon flows between these flows is very important. This is just an example. This is from some work I've been doing, and this is just looking at what I mentioned before about what we think is going to happen to the biological pump in the future. And this is a picture sort of showing the colour scale is it's a log scale. If anyone knows what that means, so you have very small numbers at this end and very big numbers at this end, and you can sort of see a sort of pattern of low carbon being put down into the ocean in the sort of the deserts of the ocean and high elsewhere. And then as we move into the future, when the ocean stratifies, everything goes blue, and what that's telling you is, it's telling you the ocean biological pump is getting weaker and weaker. And this is driven by this stratification of the ocean. I think this is a little time series here running from the year 2000 to the end of the century, under a range of different scenarios. And the scenarios go from, this is quite a benign scenario, so almost certainly not the one we'll be doing, and this one here is almost a business as usual scenario, as we call them. And it's showing the strongest effect. So this is an outcome of all this, of these models. This is the kind of thing that we in the ocean biogeochemistry are interested in producing. So just a last couple of slides on a little bit of the policy of this and how it actually works as a mechanism. So you'll be I guess most of you are aware of the IPCC. That's a kind of UN organisation that was established more than 30 years ago now to understand to assess climate research. So every couple of years they get together and they read through all the scientific research and try to produce a report on it. And they have regular reports. There's one due, I think, in 2021. It's being written at the moment. It's being finalised at the moment. One of the things they do is they make use of these models. So the model I've just shown you some of those results. They'll get used in this report to try to understand what kind of future climate we will get under these different scenarios. And these scenarios are actually performed by a completely separate organisation called CMIP. I'll stop with the acronyms already. This is essentially, it's like the Olympic Games, but for Earth system models. That's essentially that's kind of what it is. So we have they provide a forum where we compare different models. Around the world, there are about 20 or 30 different Earth system models. They're a very difficult thing to run and to build and to maintain and to operate. And there aren't actually that many. Most countries just have maybe one or two. Some countries have several more, but there are a relatively small number around the world. And because as I sort of said already, there's a lot of uncertainty in models. So one of the best ways to get around uncertainties is just to have lots of different models and to try to see by making different assumptions, how different are the answers you get. So if you think this is going to happen in the future, well, what happens if you made different assumptions? Well, one way to get to there is have different models doing the same things. And what CMIP does is it forces all the models to do the same they compete in the same events. And those events are things like 4 times CO2. You increase CO2 in the atmosphere by 4 times and then just see what happens. And this allows us to work out what the range of model behaviour is and give us some idea about how much we can trust our projections of climate change. And as I've sort of touched on already, the CMIP, we also undertake these socio-economic scenarios where we imagine different futures. Where we're all nice to each other, or we just keep doing what we're doing already, or well, actually the scenarios aren't quite as extreme as you might think. There's no Mad Max scenario, which I always think is a real omission. We need to have one where everything just goes crazy, but we don't have that one. And we in Southampton have taken part in the most recent version of the CMIP 6 using UKSM1, and some of our work just now over the next few years will be taking advantage of the work we've done to sort of see what we can say. So, summary. The ocean biology plays a kind of an important role in the carbon cycle of the Earth, but it's not a simple one. It's not quite. There's wrinkles to it. It's not a simple story. And we also need to understand how it connects to different parts of the Earth system. And by doing this, we'll kind of understand how the whole of the carbon cycle will change into the future. It's important to know how much carbon is in the ocean, how much is in the atmosphere, and the balance of these things. But because no one of these models is perfect, one of the ways in which we do this is by having lots of different models and taking part in this sort of activity. And as I say, NOC in Southampton is part of the current round of this, and that's the kind of work we're doing just now. Just a final thing, to put an ad. So every year in NOC we have an open day. I met Nigel there this year, and that's usually in June. And it's a free day. You can come down to see what we do in Dockgate 4. Our doors are open. You can come and see all the different science we do. And we had this past year we had talks by people on the challenges facing the ocean, and decided having a public debate to work out what people thought was the most important one. And we have a website, you can find it there if you want to come and visit us in 2020. I think that's my last. But and if you have any feedback for me in this talk, because as I said at the very, very start, which is a long time ago now, if you have any feedback on my talk, I'd be very interested to hear it, because it's the first one I've done. And if you want to hear any more from scientists from NOC, we have a communications team, and they're worth contacting if you want to know any more about it. And I think that is absolutely, yes, my last slide. There we go. Thank you very much.
So, questions, please? I've got one anyway. The business of the global sea ice and dropping away year after year, going less and less.
Yeah.
That's quite an obvious effect, a positive feedback effect on Earth warming, the albedo change. What's the, if there is any, with plankton, with growth on the bits of sea that were otherwise ice? I know they grow underneath ice to a certain extent.
I've looked at that myself actually, as I think because one of the things we expect to happen is at the moment the Arctic has a kind of it has in the very loose sense of the word, it has, but it's disappearing, a permanent core of sea ice which never really disappears. There's a part of the ice which is never really gone, but that part is getting smaller each year, and we expect that to disappear at some point over the next 2 or 3 decades. But until now, that's been permanently there. And in the future, perhaps by the middle towards the end of the century, we expect that to be gone, and we expect therefore the phytoplankton to be able to grow because of course you have very long days in the Arctic. Because of the inclination of the Earth towards the sun, you have 24-hour days. We expect the phytoplankton to grow much better there. So we expect the productivity of the Arctic to increase, at least at first. Later on, through the biological pump, but they won't be returned very quickly.
So negative feedback.
Essentially, what we expect the Arctic to become is we expect the Arctic to become a little bit like what the bits of the Atlantic are like now. In the end, it'll still be different. It'll still be cold. It'll still have every year. It will still have sea ice coming back. And even in the winter, even in the future, a very warm future, you'll still have sea ice in the Arctic in the winter. It'll be much thinner than it was before. But anyway, we do expect it to change, and we do expect the Arctic to at least temporarily become more productive. But the long-term consequence, the long-term fate of the Arctic is kind of unclear. There's also issues about, people think, it could be a big fishing ground there in the future, but there are issues about whether all the fish will be able to live in the Arctic. It's one thing to say, yes, there's things for you to eat there, but it's only for a short time of the year. So it's not clear that it will translate into a fully functional food web with the kind of species we have now. They may find it, but a lot of species will find it difficult in the Arctic, even if there's no sea ice. So it's not quite clear exactly what the productivity of the Arctic will be in the future.
No question.
Yes.
You said something about how you exclude the effect of fish in the model. But I just sort of wondered, how do you come to that kind of decision in general? How do you just decide what to not ignore?
That's a good question. You can be lazy. What you can do, for example, is you can, and this is my preferred approach. You run your model and you say, well, what happens if I change it? And you make the fish important. Doesn't make much of a difference to the results. And what you'll tend to find is there's certain assumptions you can make which, well, you'll find that some things are more important than others, and fish are just not one of those things that's kind of important. They're playing a role at one end of the food chain, and it's important for them, but the bottom end of the food chain doesn't really feel what they're doing. And as I say, the simple way to do it is just to demonstrate in your own model, add fish, and people have done this. You have models which are much more complicated to fish, and you find that yes, there's something important there, but it doesn't add as much as you might imagine. But it does add something, and of course, if you want to model, if you're really interested in fish, then you absolutely can't do that. You have to go there. You have to try to put that level of detail into your model. But for our end, we're interested in the main effects which control the bottom of the food chain, and fish is not one of those things. It's the nutrients, it's the light, it's the space and time variability of both those. Fish is it's an add-on on top, but it's not as important as other parts. But it is important if you're interested. If you're interested in fish, it's very important. But yeah, so but the way I would decide is if I make the assumption of having fish and not having fish, what difference does it make to my model? And it tends to make quite a small one. So that's how I make that decision. As I say, it's a lazy armchair approach, but yeah. You can also kind of work it back from first principles. How much biomass is fish compared to biomass of other things as well? Yeah, much more. So, okay. Yes?
Could you give us an idea of the range of predictions, say, over the next few decades, from between the most different models? Or
There is quite a range, and in terms of going in the future, in terms of ocean productivity, on the whole, most models tend to because they make similar assumptions about the way the world works, and those assumptions, as I say, some of those assumptions are quite well founded. We know from experiments and observations generally what can happen. Most of them would say that the oceans are going to become less productive under a much warmer world. But there are models which disagree. So some models make so one of the things which is very important in living systems is temperature plays a very important role, almost a controlling role, particularly if you're a kind of a cold-blood is the wrong word. But if you don't control your temperature, the warmer the conditions around you, the faster your metabolism typically. And for a while that makes you grow fast, makes you do everything faster. And so some of the models use that kind of relationship with temperature, and then what they would say is when the world gets warmer, the ocean gets more productive. And so there are some models that say the ocean becomes more productive into the future. But the balance of opinion is that those models are probably wrong. It's one of the attractions of having a range of models is you can sort of see you understand what the range is, and that can be quite important. But for that particular point, as I say, most people would say that those models are the emphasis they're placing is slightly wrong, and but it's out there, and you can see it. You can see it in some of the IPCC reports. Those models are. It's wrong to call them crazy models. That's very, very unkind, but they are in there as well.
Right. Really, these are very earthbound models, but the Earth itself is subject to massive solar influences, for example, and all sorts of other influences way outside the Earth's ecosystem. I wonder, are those incorporated? The effects of those incorporated?
In these models, it depends. I have to say, I'm not sure off the top of my head if we include the solar cycle in our model. I'd be a little bit surprised if we didn't. But at the same time, it's compared to other things that are happening, it's a relatively small signal. But admittedly, even quite small signals can, inside an Earth system, can build up. So, for example, the ice age. The prevailing view of what causes ice ages, or what the main driver for ice ages, is changes in the relationship between the Earth and the Sun, and how much radiation it receives from the Sun, and where that radiation falls. And so, but the changes are still quite small. But they kind of you then have an Earth system which is quite complicated, and then you can have all kinds of feedbacks inside that Earth system. So things start piling up. So you start changing temperature, and before you know you're changing CO2, which then adds more temperature, stronger temperature effect. So there are these effects. So for our own model, I'm not sure what we do with that, but with the solar cycle, but other models would definitely factor those things in. Sometimes it matters the timescale you're interested in. So the kind of models we're using here, they're quite complicated, they're quite well resolved geographically. So then they're quite expensive to run. So in a given day, a real day, we might only simulate maybe 5 years of simulated model time. Whereas some processes, like for example the Milankovitch cycles, which control the ice age, they operate over tens of thousands of years. So the idea of running our kind of model over those sort of time periods is not possible. But however, there are models which do that, simpler models, which reduce the complexity. Maybe they just describe the ocean, the whole world as just a few boxes, an atmosphere, an ocean, and a bit of land or something like that. But those models will consider those sort of things. And in the past, I've done the same myself. So I've considered ocean biogeochemistry, and I'm interested. One of the things I've been interested in the past was in volcanism and how it adds silicon to the ocean, and how that affects the diatoms, which I mentioned before. And again, the timescales over which that operates were millions of years. I was interested in a period of the Earth's history called the Eocene, which is about 50 million years ago. And at that time, there was a number of different processes happening. But for the model to run, I had to run it over literally, I think it was around over about 20 million years. And so I was using a really, really, really simple model. And I included factors to do with volcanism, to do with sources of silicon to the ocean, that we do not include in our model, because they're small sources, but they make themselves felt over long time periods. And so in a way, one of the things we always do with models is we try to choose a model to suit the problem. As we see it, of course there's always a chance we choose the wrong model. We make a simplifying assumption which is wrong. But on the whole, there's enough scientists out there, enough different modelling groups out there that not everyone thinks the same way, and we'll do tend to try different things. But to go back to your original question, not all the models will have all those the features you mentioned, but some models will have those. And I think we do factor in solar variation in some of our models. I don't know off the top of my head if ours does, but I'd be surprised if it didn't. Yes?
So what effect is it going to be with the oxygen change, which there's been science recently made to this, or is it only at the top level?
Yeah, so those who don't know, the oxygen concentration of the ocean is declining. There's one of the reasons for that is because as the ocean is warming, oxygen is less soluble. So there's a very high concentration of oxygen in the atmosphere that we're obviously very grateful for, and that's where the bulk of the oxygen in the ocean is coming from. So if you change the surface temperature, you basically make oxygen less soluble, and eventually, because of course the deeper the ocean is connected to the surface by this thermohaline circulation, eventually the ocean is essentially flushed with water which is richer in oxygen. But then if the ocean at the surface is warmer, that means less oxygen is in the surface, and therefore less oxygen in the ocean interior. So that's a phenomenon which has already been observed to happen. There's also there's sort of second order effects as well in some regions where you have a lot of nutrients going down the rivers. So nutrients going to the rivers, you have these big blooms of phytoplankton, these harmful blooms. Stuff sinks into the ocean and the oxygen is consumed. And that's another sort of separate but related issue in oxygen as well. So we expect oxygen to decline in the future. Exactly how far it will go, I think depends a lot on what's particular scenarios, and not all of the models kind of agree on that I'm aware of agree on exactly how much oxygen would decline. But at the moment, I went to a talk about 6 months ago where there was some. At the moment, this is an example of where our models are wrong. So, for example, at the moment, our models are saying that I think I'm right in saying they're saying there's less oxygen than the observations are saying. We know that from observations oxygen is going down, but the models are already saying there's less than there should be. And the real answer is probably going to lie somewhere in between, because observations we've not got a complete understanding of oxygen in the ocean. We've got a lot of measurements of it, but not everywhere and not to all depths. So it's not quite complete. So eventually the story will work out. So that's that's an evolving story, but it's certainly for a lot of the animals that live in the deep ocean, what they'll be experiencing is a growth in these we call them hypoxic or anoxic areas where they really can't live. And we'd expect that to happen. Whether it's doubtful that the ocean would go entirely anoxic. But then, as well as the lower saturations, as well as the lower concentrations of oxygen in the surface because the ocean is warmer, as I mentioned before, the ocean is stratifying as well. So by which I mean it's warming from the top, and warm water floats on top of cold water. And what that tends to mean is, it tends to mean that the surface ocean becomes more and more isolated from the bottom ocean, which basically means this ventilation, this kind of overturning circulation, becomes weaker and weaker. And that's another thing which will tend to drive oxygen concentrations down, because what will happen is you'll have productivity in the surface ocean, which will drop stuff down into the ocean interior. It will consume oxygen, but that oxygen is never, or rather is replaced extremely slowly. And we know from geological records that in the past there have been these so-called ocean anoxic events, where the ocean, large parts of the ocean go anoxic, and they're associated with mass extinction events in the ocean. There've been several of them in the past, not recent past, but the more distant past. And I haven't seen anyone yet say that that's what we're staring down a barrel of, but some of the signs point that way. That we're doing similar things which point that way. It's unlikely we're doing it for the same reasons, or not exactly the same reasons, but it remains a possibility, I suppose. But it's an evolving story, the oxygen one, and I don't think we have all the answers either from models or from observations at this time. I don't know if that answers your question. I kind of feel I've rambled on a bit there. Sorry.
On this business of oxygen, have you modelled the effect of oxygen replacement by photosynthesis?
I suppose we do, like in the model we do. And so in the model, for example, when we have prime production, the model produces oxygen. So the oxygen concentration in the model actually increases when you have prime production. In terms of, I think that the oxygen in the atmosphere is, much in the same way with carbon, it's an incredibly large reservoir. There's a lot of oxygen in the atmosphere compared to carbon, an awful lot. And certainly compared to the amount of oxygen that's produced by photosynthesis each year is actually quite small compared to the reservoir in the atmosphere. So on the whole, actually, I think I'm right in saying this, in most models we don't even consider the effect of, we consider atmospheric oxygen as being a constant, because it's so slightly affected by the prime production. That adds oxygen to the atmosphere for sure, and then of course respiration, the return process removes it. But the size of the magnitude of those fluxes, as we call them, is very small compared to the reservoir size of oxygen in the atmosphere. So we tend, certainly in all the models I've worked with, we just say it's 20%, never changes, because even if it was to change, even if the processes which change it are not large enough to change it on reasonable timescales. On long timescales, definitely. And of course, the Earth didn't have an oxygen atmosphere at one point. It's that stands out as being one of the worst pollution incidents ever. Was the oxygenation of the atmosphere? It killed almost everything that was around at the time. It was a terrible thing. Obviously, we love it now, but the reservoir of oxygen is just so large. It's something it's another example of a simplification of the model. We just say it's such an enormous reservoir. It changes this much. Let's just simplify and forget about that change and just say it's always 20%. Which is that probably sounds terrible. now I've said it out loud, it sounds terrible, but that's an example of a simplification we do. But even with changes in primary production in the future, on land, because one thing which is happening at the moment on land is, unlike the situation in the ocean, carbon is good for things on land. So carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is relatively speaking, it's not low, but it's quite low. And plants on land have trouble getting carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. One of the limiting factors for them is water. So there's a relationship between getting CO2 from the atmosphere and losing water through evapotranspiration. And so if you increase the atmospheric concentration of CO2, it becomes that much easier to get CO2 from the atmosphere. And as a result, if nothing else changes, it becomes much easier to be a land plant. And so at the moment, productivity on land is kind of increasing because of the CO2 effect. It's offset by the fact we're also knocking all the trees down in large parts of the world. We're not necessarily recovering that very quickly. But that's an example where oxygen fluxes would be slightly larger now than they were in the past, perhaps. But even then, fundamentally, the reservoir of oxygen is so enormous, and the changes each year driven by primary production are so small that we tend to we lose that one in the noise. We just say, well, let's not worry too much about that. But if we were interested in, I would say, over millions of years, that's exactly the kind of thing, exactly the kind of problem you would then start saying, I need to consider that. But for the models we're using for the climate change, we're really only looking, in fact, it's rare that we look any more than, usually we tend to look in the 21st century perspective. We look beyond that as well, because there's a lot of interesting stuff happens beyond 2100. So if we follow certain climate policies, you'll start seeing there's interesting things happen from between 2100 and 2300, or even beyond that. The long-term fate of CO2 is an interesting thing, like what happens to it. So if you stop to make CO2 tomorrow, what happens? Where does it go? Does it stay in the atmosphere? Does it go into the ocean? Does it go into land? What happens? And so we do, but again, we're only interested in relatively short. I don't think we do any simulations beyond year 3000. Some people will do, but the majority we just focus on the relatively near term of the end of the 21st century, or maybe the end of 2300. That's another kind of time point that we're always very interested in, which is far enough away it's far enough away that interesting things could happen, but not so far that we have to think about things like oxygen in the atmosphere. Yes?
I'm not an adherent of this because of the law of unforeseen consequences, that sort of thing, but the rust bucket theory, sending rust buckets around the oceans, feeding plankton around.
Yeah.
I assume that sort of thing you can feed into your models and see what's likely to happen in that sort of situation.
Yes, and a number of people have done precisely that. So they've taken models like the one that I showed you, the food web diagram, and you just say, let's just add iron into the ocean. And I've done some work on that myself. I was also one of my students. We did some work where we said that forget about the iron. Let's just say we've somehow teleported carbon into the ocean interior because of iron fertilization. We just put it in the ocean at 1,000 meters, and what happens to it? And so we did simulations, we did that, and then we tried to see how long the carbon would stay there. Because one of the things we're interested in is not just getting carbon into the ocean, but keeping it there. The ocean has, as I think I mentioned a while ago, the ocean has quite a long, we'd say, ventilation timescale. So there's parts of the ocean's always turning over. It's always turning over. And so the bottom of the ocean was at some point in the past at the surface. It just keeps going round and round. The nature of the ocean circulation means that there's some parts of the ocean which haven't seen the atmosphere for maybe more than 2,000 years. It's a long time. So the idea is, well, that's quite a long time. That's quite good. If you can get stuff into the ocean, 2,000 years, brilliant. So we focused on the area, the Southern Ocean, which you picked up on before. One of the reasons people focus on that is because there's lots of nutrients there. There's not much iron, but there's lots of nutrients. So the idea was, if you just add iron, bingo, you have a phytoplankton bloom. You'll be carbon drawn into the ocean, pumped into the ocean. So that's we focused on there, but we skipped the messy details of how the iron worked and how the carbon got into the ocean. We put it at 1,000 meters and then ran the model forward. We ran forward 100 years, which, as I said already, is a kind of typical window that we look at these things. And what we found was, relatively quickly, a lot of the CO2 would come straight back. It gets turned. The ocean's being, as I say, it's always moving. And a lot of the CO2 would come back in contact with the atmosphere, and at that point, any benefit you thought you had, you've lost. It goes back into the atmosphere, and it was like as if you'd never done anything at all.
You can break through this stratification with
because of course the stratification only affects certain parts of the ocean. In other parts of the ocean, you basically have water being brought from deep all the way up to the surface. Upwelling regions as being one, and the Southern Ocean there's a lot of upwelling in the Southern Ocean. The Southern Ocean is one of the most interesting parts of the ocean. I think it's my favourite bit, but because it's so complicated. And as a result, what we discovered was it wasn't worth doing. So we found I think it was about 70% of the carbon that you put in the ocean, in the Southern Ocean, after 100 years, it's back out into the atmosphere. If you could get stuff to 2,000 meters, well, it was slightly better, but then you start thinking, how reasonable is it to get stuff from the surface to 2,000 meters, and you start thinking not very reasonable. One of the things that ocean biology, the biological pump is a kind of an accident. It's stuff. So the way biology works is stuff grows, stuff gets eaten, stuff dies, and then usually stuff starts getting broken down. And the biological pump is the residual. It's the bit that's left. It's the bit that no one quite managed to eat before it sank out of the the upper part of the ocean. It's something which biology would rather hadn't happened. It would rather it turned into the living. It rather it would turn into flesh or zooplankton. That's what it would rather have happened. So it's this residual, and as a result, whenever you do these sort of schemes like iron fertilization, the biology is not your friend. It's working kind of against you. You might think it's working the same way as you. It's not really. It's sure you get blooms, and people have done experiments. There's been a number of experiments, small-scale experiments, where people have fertilized the ocean, again the Southern Ocean, but also areas like the North Pacific and the Equatorial Pacific as well, and other areas which are quite iron limited. And you do get effect. You can see this effect. There's a great picture of one where they added iron, and then the ocean currents basically mixed it. They stretched it into this beautiful ring you can see from space. There's a ring of green caused by the phytoplankton. But in the end, a lot of it just got consumed in the surface. And the idea that this was going to solve climate change is not. There are other ideas about the geoengineering ideas.
But at least you can try and build a model first.
So yeah, and that's an excellent example of what a model's for. You don't want to try this thing until you've done it in a model. And one of the things that I did something with a similar. I've done some work with a related, it's a separate geoengineering scheme, but the work's the same. The idea is the same. You somehow try to use the biological pump to do stuff, and you can do this experiment. You can sort of show that the idea is it just doesn't work. It works in a kind of qualitative way, as in you do this. This happens, then this happens, and more carbon gets into the ocean. But when you start putting numbers to that, you realise, and that's what one of the things models are very good at, they'll put numbers to it, you realise it's not worth it, it's not worth the effort.
Does it tend to be unforeseen consequences? Can you think the process through and find doesn't agree with what the models are?
I think that's again another very good question. So what I would say to that is, sometimes you get unforeseen consequences in models. I think in the real world you're more likely to get different unforeseen consequences because the model, as I said on a number of occasions, it sounds a terrible thing to say, but we always say the models are simpler than the real world. We always say the real world's very complex, it's too complex, let's make it simple for our model. And so we cut off some of the detail. And there will be unforeseen consequences in these things that the models don't simulate. But you do occasionally get unforeseen consequences in your model as well. You think you understand something, but because the model has a kind of life of its own, it will sometimes surprise you in what it does. But one of the things you would, and I certainly said the same myself in the study I did, we'd say, this doesn't work, but there are other things we haven't been able to consider. So to touch on the question that was mentioned before about oxygen, one of the things that's interesting is what happens to oxygen. So in the case of the iron fertilization, one idea is you add iron, you cause a phytoplankton bloom, you put more carbon into the ocean, that carbon consumes more oxygen, that oxygen then leads to anoxic conditions. Those anoxic conditions then favour the growth of methanogens, so organisms which produce methane. That methane gets into the atmosphere. Methane is a much stronger greenhouse gas than CO2, so you've kind of screwed yourself. You've started going one path, and you end up doing something much worse than if you had never started. And again, models are quite good for that. They're a little kind of tool to try to understand at least some of the consequences. They won't tell you everything because they stop. There's a certain level of complexity beyond which they don't go. They won't be able to say anything beyond that. And of course, the real world has got lots of stuff beyond that. But in the domain of things that they do include, they can say something. They can say something interesting. They can say something often quite powerful about what they. But always incomplete. We always caveat ourselves. We always say, well, we've missed this bit out. We missed that bit out. But even considering, we can still say something interesting about how this process works, how this process will work into the future, what will stop happening, what will continue happening. We can say things like that.
And presumably one we look out for chaotic solutions.
Chaos is a funny. To me, everything is chaos. The models. I
mean in a mathematical sense.
Yeah. In fact, one of the things, I didn't mention tonight because it's not particularly. It's a sort of a side detail. One of the things we do when we do our simulations of the present day and the future, one of the things we do is we simulate multiple realizations of the present day. So what we'll do is we'll start our model simulation because we don't know anything about, say, 1850. We usually start our simulations in 1850, which is it's about 100 years after the start of the Industrial Revolution, but it's as good a place to start as anywhere. But one of the things we do is we start 1850 and we start multiple versions of 1850, which are slightly different, just to sort of take advantage of some of the chaos. to sort of see if you start at a slightly different position, like you have slightly more sea ice, you have slightly less sea ice, you have a slightly warmer Atlantic, a slightly colder Atlantic. What difference does that then make when you go through, you run from 1850 through to the present day? How different does it make the solution? So we do take advantage of chaos in the models. I tend not to think about chaos that much because it's kind of to me the climate system, chaos is kind of like you don't quite. I'm trying to think how to explain this actually. The way I think of the weather system, for example, is it's like a box. And the weather you've got right now is a position, is a ball in that box. But you can't necessarily, and when you follow the weather over years, it fills in the space inside this box. You don't necessarily know where it's going to be in the box, but the box is still a box. The climate can only go to certain places. When you change climate, of course, the box changes shape and the weather can go to different places. But often we're not interested in the specifics of where the ball is inside the box. We're interested in the size of the box, size and shape of the box, the chaotic attractor that the weather is sitting on. The weather is moving around inside this chaotic attractor all the time, but you're interested in how big what the size of that is and where it is, and how the shape of that attractor is changing in time. That's a terrible answer. I'm sorry. But yeah, I tend not to think about chaos very much, but we kind of factor it into our simulations by doing this we call it an ensemble approach. We have, so in the model, some of the model simulations I showed before, we have multiple versions of the year 2000, multiple versions of of what happens in the future. They only differ in how the simulation was started. Once the simulation started, they see the same CO2 in the atmosphere, they see the same methane, all those things are the same. But the thing that's different is where they started from. It's to take advantage of this chaos inside the model, and just see how important the chaos is. Like if you start from a slightly different condition in 1850, does that matter, or do you wind up with something very similar? And one of the things we've seen in our model is from 1850 to year 2000, the initial condition does matter. So some parts of the Earth system, it really does matter where you started. To go back to the Southern Ocean, for example, the Southern Ocean, the strength of the Southern Ocean, how much water is moving from west to east in the Southern Ocean is something that changes in time. And so one of the things we did when we did this ensemble of simulations is we started the Southern Ocean at different strengths. So we found it. So behind all this is we have a simulation which is it's just seeing the pre-industrial the whole time. It's running on. It's always 1850 in this simulation. But it has natural variability inside the simulation. And all we just do is we pick places along this simulation, and we use that as our ensemble member initial condition for 1850, and then we run forward. And what we find is that during the period from 1850 to 2000, it does seem to matter. So it matters exactly what the Southern Ocean was doing at the time you picked it. But what we notice as you go to the 21st century, because climate change is such a strong signal, it's a really, really strong, it's really forcing the Earth system in one direction, because we force the model with CO2 concentrations a particular way. What you find is that all this variability between these simulations gets crushed out of them, and they all start behaving in the same way, because the signal of climate change is so strong. That might just be our model, but I'm going to be interested to see if other models are sort of the same. But I don't know, that maybe answers your question, maybe not, I'm not sure.
Well, just saying that it's known that because of chaotic conditions, we cannot forecast the weather more than about 7 days ahead.
This goes back to what I mean about this weather and this climate.
I know, but I'm taking it on a longer... I'm just taking the weather as an example, that you've got the chaotic nature of the systems, of the weather systems, which limit how much you can model it. Yeah. And I'm just asking whether you've run into the same problems on a much longer time scale.
Yeah. I don't think what I would say to that is it's important to recognise the difference between weather and climate. And as what I said before about the weather is where you are inside this box, climate is the box. And I think we trust our models to tell us something about the climate. We don't trust them to tell us about certainly not these models where we're not giving them initial conditions close to the present day. We say the model starts in 1850 from some weather state which you'd be hard pressed to say it was right or wrong. You'd say it looks pretty good. That it's hot in the right places, it's cold in the right places, but the absolute detail of it is harder to say. So I don't think that matters. That side of it. We wouldn't say we were trying to predict the weather, but we would say we were trying to get the sort of general shape of what kind of weather is possible in the model. Is what we're kind of more trying to say. Well, we'd be happier with our models for that. And one of the ways we evaluate our models is precisely that way. You don't worry so much about did we get the temperature on this location, at this day, at this particular hour exactly right. We don't worry about that. What we worry about was, in that region, do we get the annual seasonal patterns of temperature about right? Are the extremes about right? Do we stay inside the same box? That's possible for that, the same climate box that's possible for that region. That's something we should consider much more important. There are people who spend their entire life working on the statistics of those sort of things to try to make sure that the models are behaving sensibly. But we wouldn't expect, with weather models it's different, because weather models, what you just do is you say, we know what the weather's like right now, let's put that in a model and then move forward 5 days, and at that point, the model's still okay. You go forward 10 days, the model starts going wrong because of chaos. And because you always describe your model as a simplification of the reward, you start getting errors in the model, and those errors start stacking up, and they interact with the chaos that's inherent in the equations of these models. And then your predictions, the precise nature of your prediction is wrong. But it's one of those things. You'd still be probably, you wouldn't expect the temperature to drop to absolute zero in the model. That would be extraordinary. You wouldn't expect it to go to 1,000 degrees. It would just be wrong, but wrong in a way which is statistically not wildly different from the real world. But that's something which some people spend an awful lot of time trying to make sure that models are not just getting the average temperature about right, but also getting the statistics of temperature or whatever property you're interested in, that matches what we know from observations. Some people, of course, are, by contrast, exactly interested in getting weather and making weather projections better. And there are some people in my institute who are very interested in using, because some of the weather patterns we see, some of the longer term patterns in climate, so seasonal patterns, are more influenced by the ocean, because, as I mentioned earlier, the ocean is this enormous reservoir of heat. So there's a huge amount of heat in the ocean, far more than there's heat in the atmosphere. The ocean, it doesn't necessarily feel that way because the ocean is always cold, it's always bloody cold. But there's an enormous amount of heat there, and that heat can be, the Earth system can extract that heat into the atmosphere, and depending on where you've got anomalies in heat in the surface ocean, that can have an effect on longer term. So there's people in my institute who are very interested in trying to sort of predict, not necessarily predict the weather in a particular day, a particular place, but try to work out if it's going to be a hot or cold winter or something like that, based on what the ocean was doing several months before. Because the ocean has this, because it's an enormous reservoir, you can sort of view it as having an enormous memory. It has a much bigger memory. The atmosphere is a flighty thing. Heat comes and heat goes out of the atmosphere, whereas the ocean is, because of the specific heat capacity of water, it holds an awful lot of heat, and that can only change very, very slowly. So if you have too much hot water in one place, in the North Atlantic, that's going to cause an effect down the line. And seasonal forecasting of that is definitely an active research topic. Again, I'm not sure I've answered your question.
Any other questions? I think that's it. Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for coming, by the way, as well.